This is Southern Discomfort. The South is poised once again to play a pivotal role in this year's presidential election. From the end of the Civil War right up until today, North Carolina has served as a battleground state between the majority of people that at various points have pushed for transformational change and a powerful minority bent on perpetuating divisions along racial, gender, and class lines through state-sanctioned and vigilante violence or exclusion dressed up as political moderation. Despite being lauded as a leader of the progressive so-called New South, North Carolina led the way in constructing Jim Crow segregation following Reconstruction, resisted the integration of public schools after the Supreme Court's 1954 decision striking down separate but equal, and boasted more Ku Klux Klan members at the height of the Civil Rights Movement during the 1960s than all the other Southern states combined. More recently, following the Republican takeover of the state legislature in 2010, special interest groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, targeted the Tar Heel State to serve as a laboratory for new and increasingly sophisticated ways of using policy to preserve power in the hands of the few through gerrymandering and by restricting people, primarily people of color, from exercising their right to vote. Opportunity came knocking in 2013 when the United States Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required Southern states to obtain pre-clearance before they could make any changes to election law. Within hours of the decision, the Republican lawmakers in North Carolina passed a sweeping voting reform bill called House Bill 589. Just as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became the cornerstone of a successful strategy designed to ensure African American access to the ballot box, opponents of House Bill 589 argued that it paved the way for conservative legislators to suppress African American electoral participation. Resistance came swiftly. Nearly overnight, a broad coalition led primarily by the state chapter of the NAACP, under the guidance of Reverend William Barber, descended upon the North Carolina General Assembly to protest the radical policies of the Republican-controlled legislature that the protesters feared would turn back the clock on 50 years of progress towards economic, gender, and social equality.
This leadership wants to make our state a place of deeper stratification and inequality. It's not accidental or naive. It's premeditated and it's planned. They are following the playbook of Alex, the playbook of Civitas, the playbook of John Locke, the playbook of the Koch brothers, but they didn't know that we were going to get in the game and stop the players.
The demonstrators returned every Monday that summer. The Moral Monday movement, as it came to be known, garnered national attention and resulted in more than 1,000 people being arrested for civil disobedience. Unfortunately, the Southern predicament has become the scourge of the nation. Variations of the voter suppression tactics used in North Carolina have been deployed throughout the country, and they have been on full display during the coronavirus pandemic. Formerly incarcerated people in Florida were recently denied access to the ballot box because of outstanding fines. The closure of polling sites in Milwaukee during the April primary election forced Black and Latinx voters to wait in long lines to vote at grave risk to their health. On the national level, recent cuts to the United States Postal Service could play a major role in the outcome of the 2020 presidential election when an estimated 80 million Americans are expected to vote by mail. Joining me now to examine these recent attacks on our democracy through the lens of the long struggle for voting rights in North Carolina are Robert Korstad and James Leloudis. Korstad is a professor emeritus of public policy at Duke University, and Leloudis is a professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill. They just wrote a new book called Fragile Democracy: The Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina. What were your goals for writing Fragile Democracy, and what are you hoping that people take away from reading about this history?
What we've attempted to do in Fragile Democracy is to tell the story of race and voting rights from the end of the Civil War, from emancipation, all the way up to the present day. And, we've tried to look at the place of race in the sort of health of our democracy. I think one of the things you see when you look at this long story is that the struggle over race in the franchise is played out through cycles, on one hand, of emancipatory politics, and on the other hand, conservative retrenchment. And we see that happening again and again over the last 150 years or so. And I think the central thing to understand is that when race has been used as an instrument of exclusion from political life, the result has been a society in which vast numbers of Americans, black and white alike, are denied the elements of meaningful freedom. Things like a good job, quality education, good health, a good home. So, in that sense, these questions of race and access to the ballot box are just absolutely central to the health of our society broadly and the health of our democracy.
We wrote Fragile Democracy as a way of bringing North Carolinians into this longer story. To have people who are out registering people to vote, trying to mobilize in the midst of this pandemic, to have them see themselves as part of a long process, like the people who participated in Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964, or the participants in the Constitutional Convention of 1868 in North Carolina. It's not just an isolated moment today, but people can really see the work they're doing as part of a continuation of efforts to establish a democratic society in North Carolina.
Your book makes it very clear that North Carolina was not just an ancillary player in promoting white supremacy. How did successive attempts to maintain white supremacy in the state translate into something you call the Carolina Way?
I think if you look at the history of race and voting rights in North Carolina, I think you can argue that historically North Carolina has been the purplest of purple states. That this state has been at various points in its history remarkably progressive, and those are at the moments when a multiracial alliance, black and white, in our own time, Hispanic and Native American, have managed to hold on to political power and have vastly expanded the role of the state and the investment the state makes in public welfare. And on the flip side of that, we've also seen sweeping periods of political retrenchment of the sort that we're living in now. And the difference between those two outcomes is remarkably small. I mean, if you see this again and again throughout the history, it takes the moving only a very small number of voters to make a profound difference. And race and racism have been central to that project of swaying and moving those voters from one side of the ledger to the other.
North Carolina has also, I think, been a leader in this whole process of what we're calling emancipatory politics, both in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War and the fusion movement in the late 19th century. In the 1960s, the important role of Greensboro and the sit-ins in the civil rights movement, the central role that North Carolina played in the Southern War on Poverty. And then more recently, with the Moral Monday movement, North Carolina has really been a leader in the South in pushing back against so many of the conservative initiatives that have come in the wake of President Obama's election. So the Carolina Way, which we talk about in the book, was, I think, a moment in this larger history of white supremacy that was characterized by what one civil rights activist in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, phrased it this way: if you beat the white man at one trick, he will try another. And what that meant was that at every moment that blacks initiated participation in the electoral process, North Carolina legislatures would come up with a new rule, a new election law, a new tactic to try to marginalize or block black empowerment. And in the 1950s, they didn't do it with violence, which is what they'd done in the 1870s and the late 1890s. They did it in more subtle ways, which in some ways people saw as a form of kind of moderation. But underneath it was, a very pernicious form of blocking the participation in the democratic process of African Americans.
Reverend William Barber drew inspiration from the fusion movement, which saw black Republicans joining hands with populist white farmers to expand democracy in North Carolina, to inform the Moral Monday movement, and now the revived Poor People's Campaign. Can you talk about the fusion movement and then the white supremacist backlash that culminated in the Wilmington coup of 1898?
You could argue that if biracial, multiracial politics had any chance of success in the late 19th century, from the end of the Civil War to 1900, it was probably in North Carolina. I mean, during Reconstruction, a larger percentage of white voters than any other Southern state crossed the race line and made common cause with newly emancipated, newly entitled to citizenship former slaves. And that effort to build a more democratic North Carolina, of course, we know was beaten back by Klan violence in the late 1860s and early 1870s. But black men could still vote through the 1870s and through the 1880s and into the 1890s. And so that potential for another biracial alliance was all there. And it became a reality again in the mid 1890s, largely caused by the economic shock of the panic of 1893, really a depression in the early 90s. And again, large numbers of whites left the Democratic Party, joined the new populist movement, and made common cause with blacks and their white allies in the Republican Party. And so that's what we know as fusion. And the elections of 1894 and 1896, that alliance gained control not only of the state legislature, but also of the governor's office. And again, North Carolina was different here. Fusion movements emerged elsewhere in the South, but only in North Carolina did they manage to take control of both of those branches of government. And what they did in terms of new state investments in social welfare, changes to election law, they created what historians have long described as one of the most democratic, with a little d, politics and society in the late 19th century South. And again, that was met with a vicious white supremacy campaign in which white Democrats with a capital D turned to fraud and violence to defeat that alliance once for all. And once they had returned to power, they disenfranchised black men with an amendment to the state constitution that required a literacy test in order to register to vote. It was a way of making sure that having beaten this alliance back a second time, that it would not re-emerge a third time in the 20th century.
Right. And those attacks on democracy culminated in the bloody Wilmington coup of 1898.
An armed, well-organized group of white insurgents rose up to displace a biracial fusion government in Wilmington. They marauded through black neighborhoods. They killed mercilessly. They ran the government out of office and, in fact, banished hundreds of leading black citizens. It was the only municipal coup d'etat in American history.
Walk me through the political gains that were made during the fusion period, when whites and blacks crossed racial and class lines to work together to demand change.
Bold new investments in public welfare. For example, the fusion legislature in the late 1890s equalized per capita spending on black and white school children. I mean, that's something that often shocks people. They don't imagine that that could have happened in the late 19th century. They passed in 1895 one of the most progressive election laws in the South. And again, some of the provisions are really quite surprising to people. In 1895, that law required that employers give workers time off to vote. It required campaign finance reporting. It accommodated illiterate voters, about a third of whites and about two-thirds of blacks, by allowing parties to print their ballots on color-coded paper with graphic, visual identifiers so that illiterate voters couldn't be defrauded. I mean, this was an extraordinary experiment in meaningful, substantive democracy.
As you mentioned earlier, the fusion era ended with the Wilmington coup and the Democratic Party takeover in 1900, which you write in the book cleared the way for a new order characterized by one-party government, racial segregation, cheap labor, and grinding poverty. Talk about the brutal caste system that was implemented by North Carolinians against blacks, and how it also affected poor whites in the state as well.
Right. In the wake of the white supremacy campaign and disfranchisement at the turn of the century, white elites in North Carolina, and this was true elsewhere in the South, and the timing was a little different in each state, but established a regime of what's called Jim Crow. And I think one of the important things to remember about Jim Crow is it's not simply a story of race, just as, slavery wasn't just a matter of race. It was a matter of economics, of creating a system of power and plunder, to use Ta-Nehisi Coates' term, both in the antebellum period, but particularly in the period after 1900. So they create a caste system we know is segregation. There are laws that prohibit African Americans from, riding on streetcars with whites, from being buried in cemeteries. We've seen all the traditional signs of water fountains, et cetera, et cetera. But it was really the creation of a racial division of labor that I think characterized Jim Crow most profoundly. And that was a system in which, for the most part, African Americans were banished to the countryside where they worked in agriculture as sharecroppers and tenant farmers, or in the small towns of the state where large numbers of African American women worked as domestic workers. It isolated whites for the most part in the textile industry, which was almost an entirely white industry. But black earnings, which were kept really at the subsistence level in agriculture and other economic pursuits, really set the floor for wages for everyone and kept white wages pulled down. And Jim Crow was also a system that really enforced a fear in white workers that if they violated the tenets of Jim Crow and segregation, whether by making common cause with African Americans or by joining labor unions or protesting their own low wages, they could lose their racial privilege, which gave them just a small foot up in this regime of Jim Crow. And what that did was keep the wages of poor whites and of virtually all African Americans very low, and it meant that North Carolina was a chronically poor state with large numbers of people living in poverty well into the 20th century.
Talk about the individuals like Carolina Times editor Louis E. Austin, who resisted the status quo and agitated for expanding democracy for people of color.
Whites had made it very clear by the end of the 19th century that they were not going to abide by the terms of Black citizenship and Black freedom that had been established at the end of the Civil War, particularly with the 14th Amendment, the guarantee of citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, the guarantee of the right to vote. But as overwhelming as the political defeat, the victory of white supremacy was at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, the remarkable thing is that Black North Carolinians, they didn't concede. But instead, during the sort of worst times of Jim Crow, maintained the struggle for equal citizenship and for civil rights. And Lewis Alston, who was editor of the Carolina Times, the state's leading Black newspaper, is a great example of that. And his story also points to the political realignment that begins to happen as early as the 1930s and culminates in the 1960s, when Democrats of the late 20th century look like Republicans of the late 19th, and Republicans of our time look more like the conservative Democrats of the late 19th century. But Alston in the 1930s urged Black voters to go out to attempt to pass the literacy test and to vote register to vote as Democrats. It's the beginning of an abandonment of the party of Lincoln, of the Republican Party. And the logic, Alston said, was that you needed to carry the fight to where the power was. And in North Carolina, in the American South, before the 1960s, the power is squarely within the Democratic Party. And so what's fascinating here is that Alston kind of carries the revolution right to the belly of the beast.
Can you compare Austin's crusade with that of Local 22, an interracial labor union in Winston-Salem, led primarily by Black women at the height of Jim Crow segregation? Having won an historic labor election in 1943, the workers began to focus their efforts in demanding greater democracy, not just on the shop floor, but out in the community as well. In fact, Local 22 spearheaded a major voter registration drive that resulted in the election of the first Black candidate to win a municipal election in the South since the Wilmington coup in 1898. As one worker famously said, "It was just like being reconstructed."
Austin's efforts began in the early 1930s and really spread around the state with the development of state organizations. And one of the most remarkable moments, I think, in this kind of early expansion, this early voting rights movement in North Carolina, was the unionization of mostly African-American tobacco workers at R.J. Reynolds Company in Winston-Salem. Workers, about 8,000 strong, organized a local of the Food and Tobacco Workers, which is a CIO union, in 1943. And after they had signed a collective bargaining agreement with the company, began to look to the political sphere as a way of consolidating that power. And there's a great quote from Robert Black, who is the rank and file leader of Local 22, looking back, thinking about what was at stake there. And he said, if you're going to defeat these people, he explained, not only do you do it across the negotiating table in the R.J. Reynolds building, but you go to City Hall, you elect people down there that's going to be favorable and sympathetic and represent the best interest of the working class. And, you know, it was really remarkable in Winston-Salem. The union started sponsoring citizenship classes, literacy classes. They start going en masse to register workers to vote. They participate in the 1944 and 1946 congressional elections and were probably the key votes in 1946. And in 1947, they build a biracial coalition with white unionists in Winston-Salem and some progressive whites to help elect Reverend Kenneth Williams to the city council. He was the first African-American to win an election against a white opponent in the 20th century South. So again, this battle to gain access to the ballot, to participate in this democracy was really taking place on many different fronts in this period.
If you want to look at the roots of our modern political discourse, including the way that conservatives have used identity politics to divide Americans along racial and class lines, I think you have to look to North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms. Can you talk about Helms's use of race, but also his skill with using the media to maintain his grip on power for 30 years?
Jesse Helms had a very long history of using the race card to win a political victory. You know, he first emerged as an influential figure in 1950 in the Democratic primary contest for nomination for U.S. Senator. And that primary pitted UNC President Frank Porter Graham against Willis Smith, a Raleigh attorney, former president of the American Bar Association. And that race at the end of the day pivoted on the issue of race. The first primary was very close. Graham won by a plurality, but not a majority. And so Willis Smith had the option of calling for a runoff. Now, he was inclined not to do that until a young radio reporter named Jesse Helms began organizing supporters in Raleigh to go to Willis Smith's front yard and to encourage him to call for a runoff election, a runoff primary. And Willis Smith did that. And in that final campaign, Willis Smith's forces, and Helms is a central player in this, made race the central issue. There are infamous broadsides that many people are familiar with, urging white North Carolina voters to wake up. The broadside said, before it's too late. Frank Porter Graham favors mingling of the races. One of the bitterest and most consequential elections in North Carolina history. Willis Smith defeats Graham and goes off to Washington, and he takes his young protege, Jesse Helms, with him. Well, fast forward to 1972, which is really the turning point moment for the reemergence or rebirth of two-party politics in North Carolina. And Helms wins election to the Senate, a seat he would hold for 30 years.
Can you discuss Helms's 1990 campaign against Harvey Gantt, the first Black Democrat to run for U.S. Senate? It is such a good example of how Helms could reliably play the, quote, race card to ensure victory.
That campaign in 1990 against Harvey Gantt, it too goes in the Ledger book as one of the most contentious campaigns in North Carolina history. And again, racial appeals, they became the deciding factor. The race was very, very close until just days before Election Day. The Helms campaign came up with a television commercial that focused on a pair of white hands, a wedding band, crumpling a job rejection letter. And the voiceover says, you wanted that job, you deserved that job, but they had to give it to a minority
because of a racial quota. Is that really fair? Harvey Gantt says it is. Gantt supports Ted Kennedy's racial quota law that makes the color of your skin more important than your qualifications. You'll vote on this issue next Tuesday. For racial quotas, Harvey Gantt. Against racial quotas, Jesse Helms.
And that ad really played a major role in turning enough white voters to defeat Harvey Gantt.
It's really important here to understand that these racial appeals, really began going national, starting in the 1960s, particularly during the 1964 campaign with Goldwater, but more particularly with the Nixon campaign in '68. Running using the dog whistle of law and order as a way to try to appeal to the anxieties of white voters. It's what's interesting is to see on a national level what you can see very clearly in this history in North Carolina, going back to the end of the Civil War. This effort to use race and racism and kind of racial anxiety to appeal to white voters. It's looks like a bad movie being rerun over and over again.
During Reconstruction, white supremacists knew they couldn't take back power by legitimate means, so they turned to vigilante violence and the KKK. Later, during the 1980s, staunch conservatives like Senator Jesse Helms still had to fall back on racism in order to clinch their elections. Many things are different today, but something that is similar is that the policy priorities that conservatives are pushing remain less popular than progressive ones, like Medicare for All and debt-free college. President Trump admitted as much when he said that Republicans wouldn't win elections without voter suppression measures that ensured their preservation. Do you think that this is driving a lot of the voter suppression tactics that we are seeing in North Carolina and around the country?
I think that's absolutely central, Jonathan. I mean, one of the most important things to recognize is that, if we fast forward a little bit and think about House Bill 589, that omnibus election law reform bill passed in 2013 and ultimately rejected by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. That piece of legislation restricting access to the ballot box was not crafted in a vacuum. All right, but the very same legislature that wrote that legislation also turned down Medicaid funding that would have expanded health care to nearly 500,000 North Carolinians. It's the same legislature that made unemployment benefits in North Carolina some of the skimpiest in the nation. It's the legislature that did away with North Carolina's earned income tax credit, which economists across the political spectrum agree is one of the most effective means of lifting people out of poverty. It's the same legislature that dramatically reduced on a per capita basis investment in public education in this state.
What's important always in understanding this history is that the confluence of voter suppression with the efforts to minimize the role that government plays in the everyday lives of people. As we look back over the course of the period from the end of the Civil War to the present, what we've seen is really two very different visions of society fighting it out with each other. One that's been led by conservatives that believes in minimal government, limited taxation, and quite frankly, limited participation by citizens in the exercise of democracy. And another vision that sees government as a vehicle for creating opportunity for everyone, to expand education, healthcare, social welfare benefits, to create a society that benefits the whole and not just individuals. That's really the subtext of these struggles that have been going on over this period of time. The racial dimension gets the headlines, but I think the real story in some ways is what's going on underneath, and these tensions between these two very different understandings of what government is all about.
Yeah, I think that was really highlighted in the Moral Monday movement. Can you talk about how the movement was able to put a spotlight on harmful legislation coming out of the General Assembly, like HB 589?
I think one of the most fascinating things about the response to House Bill 589 and these efforts to suppress the vote in North Carolina was the remarkable resistance to that, led by NAACP and its president, Reverend William Barber. The Moral Monday movement that started really just in the immediate aftermath of the legislation that's coming out of the General Assembly was remarkable in the way in which it tried to bring people from lots of different walks of life in North Carolina together. So Reverend Barber was very self-consciously looked to the fusion movement of the late 19th century, to other multiracial, multi-ethnic, cross-class alliances that had existed in North Carolina. and using tactics of the civil rights movement, nonviolent civil disobedience, with mass arrests, sitting in the General Assembly. It was a remarkable effort, ultimately quite successful, I think, when put together with the legal challenges that were initiated by the NAACP to have many of the election laws declared unconstitutional. So, in the last decade, while the conservatives made one of their best efforts yet to try to limit the participation of North Carolina citizens in the democratic process, people took it upon themselves to resist that in a way that has been quite successful.
Judges have rolled back the most egregious redistricting maps, as well as voter suppression legislation like House Bill 589. As welcome as these victories are to advocates hoping to expand the franchise, how confident are you two that conservative forces will regroup and come up with a new strategy to restrict voting access? And if not here on the state level, then maybe on the national level?
I would not assume for a moment that defeat of those efforts means in any regard that the battle has been won. I think, again, the history of this state suggests that it has always been a purple state, often been a bruised state. The fight has been intense. And I think the message of this history is that securing our democracy, securing a government that is committed to advancing the welfare of us all, requires unrelenting vigilance. And it also requires that we attend to the duties and responsibilities of citizenship, that we speak up and have our voices heard, and that we turn out at the polls and exercise that right to vote. What's going on here in North Carolina is very much an American story. This is the nation in microcosm. And I think when you zoom out, that you could argue that the Supreme Court of the United States has done as much work as anyone else in dismantling the kinds of democratic progress that's been made since the Civil Rights Movement. Citizens United opened the door wide to unaccountable private money in shaping campaigns. And of course, Shelby v. Holder gutted the Voting Rights Act by removing Section 5, which had required pre-clearance of any changes to election law in covered jurisdictions, including most of North Carolina. I mean, what's interesting with House Bill 589 is that Republicans in the legislature had been working for some time on ideas to restrict access to the ballot box, and the Supreme Court handed them an extraordinary gift in Shelby v. Holder, just cleared the path entirely. And so the history is pretty clear about the stakes. When alliances of that sort have been broken in one manner or another, and historically that's often been accomplished by the opposition playing the race card, the consequences are pretty dire. And a lot rests on our capacity to do the organizing and finding ways to promote the kind of state and the kind of nation we aspire to live in.
Robert Korstad and James Leloudis are the authors of Fragile Democracy: The Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina. Music for Southern Discomfort was recorded by Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Jonathan Michaels.